Professor Lessig, let's start by talking about the title of your book. It says Remix, Making Art and Commerce Thrive in the Hybrid Economy. It seems to imply that we need to do something to make art and commerce thrive, and if we don't, then it is not going to thrive.
Exactly right. I think that at the end of the book, I outline changes we need to make in the law, but also changes we need to make in ourselves. The culture that was produced by the 20th century is not a good culture for the potential of the 21st century. And so I think we need to think about both how we need to change and how we need to make our institutions different.
What happens if we don't change anything? What's the worst case scenario here?
Well, I'm actually optimistic for the first time in a long time about this, but if I were my old pessimistic self, I think the worst case is that as the industries figure out how to exercise control over the way culture gets made and spread, we close down a lot of the potential for amateur and different kinds of creativity to take advantage of this platform. And so a lot of what this is about is how do we make it so that that potential remains, while also making it possible for commercial entities to profit from the way that this culture gets built.
Allow me to push you just a little bit on that. I mean, this is the United States we're talking about. We produce a record number of music, films, books. Innovation on the net doesn't seem to be slowing down. People are still producing, social networking sites and wikis and blogs in record numbers. So innovation seems to be going fine. What is the real risk here?
It's hard to see the innovation that doesn't get done because you don't see the thing we're missing. But there is a way in which the innovation that's most important to me, which is innovation of really amateur, non-professional culture that's using digital technologies to create and share their work. That innovation, of course, is happening, but it's not happening in a way that we are encouraging or ratifying inside our society. Kids take digital objects like music or video and they remix it and they want to share it with their friends. They post it on YouTube. Lawyers come along and slap them with a notice and takedown and force it off the network. We don't teach this stuff in our schools, so we don't take advantage of how kids could learn more by learning to be reflective in the way they make movies or the way they remix content. That's a kind of innovation that we lose merely because hanging over the heads of these institutions that have to obey the law, are rules that make them believe that this type of creativity, this type of activity is not to be encouraged. So that's an important thing that we lose. And also, the thing that drove me to write this book was this recognition, as I described in the beginning, something that Jack Valenti was obsessed with, the recognition of the cost to a culture of having a whole generation raised believing that what seems natural and obvious to them is a criminal act, because it alienates them from the way culture tries to develop and the way law regulates.
That's great. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to go back to the question that Stephen Colbert posed to you the other day.
What's the difference between remixing somebody's work and just theft? If I go into Brooks Brothers and walk out with a handful of ties and get caught, can I just say, oh, I was just remixing the patterns?
What's wrong with that analogy?
One thing I think is important is to first distinguish between one activity that is the motivation for the war, the copyright war, which is peer-to-peer file sharing. And that is somebody just taking somebody else's content and sharing it with their 10,000 best friends. I don't encourage that activity. I don't support it. I don't think people ought to do it. But the point of this book is that we've been waging a war against that for 10 years and it has failed. We've had our surge, and it has failed. And so I think we should stop waging a failed war and stop suing kids and start suing for peace. But the other half of the book is talking about a genuinely creative activity, remix, which doesn't take anything away from anybody else. So when you walk into a store, or when Stephen walks into Brooks Brothers and takes the ties and walks out with them and defends it by the fact that the ties are mixed together, Brooks Brothers doesn't have ties to sell anymore. They actually have lost something, and it's something in the real world that's substantial. Obviously, that type of theft is the sort of thing the law tries to stop. But when I take a movie, or when a kid takes a song by Wilco and remixes it and shares it with his friends, Wilco isn't any worse off. Indeed, Wilco is better off because more people know Wilco's music, and Wilco now is a more popular demand and a higher demanded band. So there is no harm from that. And indeed, there's great benefit from that to the extent that a kid learns the extraordinary difficulty in actually producing something good or remixing something in a way anybody wants to listen to.
But isn't that something for the artist to decide?
The law needs to decide whether that's something for the artist to decide. That's the scope, the reach of copyright law. And so the question for copyright law is, does the law need to hand out this government-granted monopoly over that kind of control? Is there a benefit to restricting that kind of speech? Because that's what this is. It's a restriction on speech. It's saying you can't express yourself in this way. Now, I think there's lots of good justification for restricting that speech when it comes to, for example, Hollywood $100 million blockbuster. I don't think anybody has the right to take that movie and share it with their 100,000 best friends for free. That's a restriction on speech that I think is justified by the need to create the incentives to produce that great work. Mm-hmm. But where you've got a use that doesn't hurt anybody at all, but in fact gives somebody an opportunity to express himself or herself differently, there is no justification for the law handing out a monopoly that silences that speech. So the law ought to be reformed, in my view, especially in the context of amateur creativity, to say that it's not actually the right of the author or the artist to control that remix, and so therefore it should be a free activity anybody can engage in.
Right. Doesn't this strike at the heart of what a free market is supposed to be about, where a buyer and seller decide mutually between them the terms of the sale, including the price?
When Penguin publishes this book, mm-hmm. Penguin doesn't have the right, according to the law, to say that a bookstore can sell this book, but you can't sell that book in a used bookstore. It doesn't have the right to say that, because the law explicitly limits the monopoly right that copyright is to say that after the first sale, this book can be sold however people want to buy and sell it. Now you could say...
So you're saying it's already limited.
It's limited, and the right of copyright has always been limited. We recognize we need to create a copyright, and I support copyright, but it shouldn't extend beyond what's necessary to create the incentives to produce great work. So where it extends, protect it, but limit it to make sure it doesn't extend beyond what it needs to.
Yeah. Who's waging this war, and who are the players involved?
Well, the war metaphor was demanded by the industry, who said that they're waging a war against piracy. So it's the copyright wars. It's what Jack Valenti, the late head of the Motion Picture Association of America, referred to as his own, quote, terrorist war, mm-hmm. where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children, right? So they say they're waging war against this unambiguous wrong or unambiguous harm. And what I point to in the book is that, the obvious point about the way in which this metaphor, this way of thinking, blinds us to the fact that there might be other ways to achieve the same objectives of the war without the cost.
So the parties in the war there's the music and the motion picture industries on one side.
And kids on the other.
And the kids on the other side.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're on the side of the kids.
Not in the sense that I would ever tell a kid, go ahead and peer-to-peer file share. I don't support peer-to-peer file sharing. But I'm on the side of the kids in the sense that I say, this is an unjustified war. It's not achieving its objectives. 10 years ago, we said it wasn't going to achieve its objectives, but at least it was an open question. Maybe it would work. But it hasn't worked. So it hasn't worked for the kids. It's turned them into criminals. They have a generation of kids who think of themselves as criminals. It hasn't worked for artists. Artists haven't gotten any money from this war. Whenever RIAA sues, the money goes to the lawyers. It doesn't go to the artists, or maybe it goes to the RIAA, but they don't give it to the artists. It hasn't helped businesses, because businesses have lived in this extraordinary uncertainty about what, in fact, they can do without fear of being sued by the RIAA. So it's helped none of the people it should be helping. The only people it's helped is lawyers. Now, I like lawyers. I make them for a living, right? So it's not like I'm against lawyers. But I think that we ought to have a system that's worrying about artists and worrying about whether the law is being obeyed first, and worry about the lawyers second.
You say that the record industry launched something like 17,000 lawsuits?
More than that.
More than that,
yeah.
Now.